Hey everyone, this is the third chapter from Alex Callinicos' book, Trotskyism. This chapter is titled Orthodoxies. It's the third chapter in the book if you're curious about that. But I don't know when and if I'm going to finish reading all the chapters in this book, so I'm just releasing all the different chapters I happen to read as like separate things, right? So, if it I'll probably eventually make a playlist with these things in it. Anyway, the first section of this chapter is titled Uncritical Positivism and Uncritical Idealism. Marx, writing in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 that even Hegel's phenomenology of spirit contains implicit within it, quote, the uncritical positivism and the equally uncritical idealism of Hegel's later works. That philosophical dissolution and restoration of the existing empirical world, end quote. The thought is that by making absolute spirit, a hypostatization of human mental life, the subject of history, Hegel prevents the categories of his dialectic from obtaining any critical purchase on the world. Thought and reality so abruptly fused in the absolute, the identical subject-object of both nature and history fall asunder, so that thought, supposedly omnipotent over reality, in fact, as Wittgenstein put it, leaves everything as it is. An analogous oscillation between, quote, uncritical positivism, end quote, and, quote, uncritical idealism, end quote, can be seen at work in Orthodox Trotskyism. Orthodox Trotskyism was constituted, as we saw in the previous chapter, by the decision to preserve Trotsky's analysis of the USSR as a degenerated worker state by extending it to China and Eastern Europe. This was in fact merely the most important instance of a powerful drive to defend his thought from refutation. Cannon's denial in November 1945 that the Second World War was over in order to avoid admitting that Trotsky's prediction that the Stalin regime would not survive the war was an extreme case of the same drive, but there are many other examples of similar tendency. Thus, Ernest Mandel in 1951 seized on Michel Pablo's prediction of a, quote, war revolution, end quote, that would settle the hash of both Stalinism and capitalism to argue that, quote, the period elapsing between the Second and Third World Wars will appear in history as a temporary interlude, and prediction of Trotsky that the bureaucracy would not survive a war would find itself historically confirmed, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Thus, seeking to immunize Trotsky's theories from refutation carried with it the danger of transforming them into a set of dogmas. All too frequently, this danger was realized. The transitional program drafted by Trotsky and adopted at the First Congress of the Fourth International in 1938 became an essential object of veneration. And a special object of veneration. This document, the transitional program drafted by Trotsky and adopted at the First Congress of the Fourth International, was thus named because it contained a set of, quote, transitional demands, end quote. For example, the indexation of wages to prices, quote, sliding scale of wages, end quote. These were intended to bridge the old division in the Second International before 1914 between the minimum program of limited reforms attainable within a capitalist context and the maximum program whose implementation would require the establishment of workers' power. Trotsky argued that the economic crisis was so acute that the struggle for even the most modest improvement in working-class conditions would come into conflict with the capitalist world system itself. By agitating for transitional demands, the Fourth International would draw around it workers who would discover in the course of their efforts to realize these demands the limitations of reformism. Thus, Trotsky described the transitional demands as, quote, stemming from today's conditions and today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat, end quote. Reisner. The idea was not a new one. Lenin's slogan, "Bread, Land, Peace," is probably the best example of a transitional demand, and the early Comintern sought to make it the basis of the Communist Party's daily agitation. Trotsky does not seem to have been especially strongly committed to the particular demands contained in the transitional program, and stressed the importance of being able to, quote, put forward at the right moment sharp, specific fighting slogans that by themselves don't derive from the, quote, program, but are dictated by the circumstances of the day and lead the masses forward, end quote. Trotsky. This warning was generally ignored by Orthodox Trotskyists, who tended rather to treat the detailed demands outlined in the transitional program as unalterable. This went along with a propensity to make a fetish of the idea of, quote, the program, end quote, itself. Its presence or absence was treated as the decisive factor determining whether or not a particular movement would realize the revolutionary potential attributed to it. Typically involved in these attitudes was a refusal to contemplate the possibility that Trotsky was mistaken in assuming that future capitalist economic expansion was ruled out. This bred an economic catastrophism of which Jerry Healy and Jerry Healy's followers provide the classic case. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, they ignored the abundant evidence of a worldwide boom to announce an imminent and drastic slump. The Healyite WRP, the actual onset of global recession in the early 1970s, was greeted with a fervor almost comparable to that of a Christian fundamentalist in the face of the Second Coming. It is perhaps appropriate here to consider why it was that the Trotskyist movement should so often have displayed the characteristics of religious sectaries. One could plausibly argue that it is generally true of radical movements in adverse circumstances that they dissolve into disputatious fragments. Christopher Hill, for example, traced the complex process through which English revolutionaries sought to cope with the rule of Cromwell's major generals and the Restoration, integral disintegration, the Fifth Monarchists, accommodation, the Harringtonians, retreat into political quietism, the Quakers, or into art, Milton. Certainly we can see many analogies with what happened to the Trotskyist movement from the 1940s onward. Furthermore, the inability to influence events is itself likely to encourage splits, since there is no way of settling differences in analysis or policy by practical tests. Why not break away? By transforming the theoretical basis of the movement into a set of irrefutable dogmas, Orthodox Trotskyism strengthened this temptation. Each distinct current sought to establish itself as the sole authentic interpreter of the tradition's founding text. Orthodox Trotskyism was further disabled by the idea of the Fourth International itself. Its predecessor and model, the Comintern, had been based on the Bolsheviks' ability as the leaders of a successful revolution to rally a substantial portion of the Western labor movement to the new international. The Comintern was thus a mass organization at whose first three congresses, 1919 to 1921, at least the views of its predominantly Russian leadership were challenged and criticized in the light of the experience of the Communist Party's attempts, sometimes successful, to influence the huge social conflicts of the time. The pretensions of a political current numbering a few thousand to be such an international had a crippling effect on the Trotskyist movement, in particular encouraging delusions of grandeur in the, quote, unknown men, end quote, who took charge of the international Secretariat in the mid-40s as the leaders of the, quote, World Party of the Socialist Revolution, end quote. The attempt to follow events in many countries, integrating them into a global perspective and offering detailed tactical advice to the local groups was something which Trotsky could more or less pull off, though at a price, but continued by his epigony. It invited the disasters which actually occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The result was the absurdity of a plethora of groupings, usually with a few hundred members apiece, each claiming either to be or to be engaged in the, quote, reconstruction, end quote, of the Fourth International. Hardly more inviting was the alternative pursued by the United Secretariat of the Fourth International after 1963 of seeking to prevent further splits while hanging on to the fiction of the Fourth International by endless compromises which sought to hold together political tendencies, respectively the supporters of Ernest Mandel and of the American Socialist Workers' Party, which often seem to have little left in common. One consequence of making a theory immune to refutation is that, as Popper pointed out, it is then consistent with any set of observations. The obverse of a dogmatism so rigid as to ignore any contradictory evidence is a flexibility so supple that it can incorporate everything into its framework at the price of explaining nothing. Ernest Mandel is probably the best example of this tendency within Orthodox Trotskyism. A brilliant and prolific writer and orator, especially skilled in debate, Mandel has, by the scope and erudition of his major economic treatises, Marx's Economic Theory, Late Capitalism, The Second Slump, lent a much-needed prestige to the United Secretariat of the Fourth International, whose main leader Ernest Mandel had been for the past quarter-century. There is, in fact, an organic connection between Mandel's conception of scientific method as elaborated and applied in his economic writings and his defense of Trotskyist orthodoxy. In Late Capitalism, the book, Ernest Mandel's main attempt to account for the long post-war boom and its subsequent collapse into crisis at the end of the 1960s, Mandel rejects as, quote, monocausal, end quote, theory of the evolution of capitalism. On the contrary, quote, up to a certain point, all the basic variables of this mode of production can partially and periodically perform the role of autonomous variables, naturally not to the point of complete independence, but in an interplay constantly articulated through the laws of development of the whole capitalist mode of production, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Ernest Mandel lists 6 such variables: the organic composition of capital, the distribution of constant capital between fixed and circulating capital, the rate of surplus value, the rate of accumulation, the turnover time of capital, and the relationship between the means of production department and the means of consumption department, the sectors producing capital and wage goods, respectively. And much of the book is devoted to exploring the way in which these variables shape the post-war world economy. The difficulty, particularly from the point of view of Marxism's aspiration to be a theory of social reality, is that Mandel provides no general account of the relative importance of the variables. This does not seem consistent with Marx's own, quote, method of rising from the abstract to the concrete, end quote. This treats certain features of the economy as more fundamental than others, and it is indeed remarkably close to, quote, the theory of self-contained factors, end quote, vigorously denounced by Trotsky. Substantively, Mandel's stress on multiple causality leads at times to a syncretism, perhaps most evident in his unsuccessful attempt to integrate the idea of long waves of economic development, most fully formulated by Kondratiev, with Marx's theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. What the hell does syncretism mean? Syncretism, the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. Interfaith dialogue can easily slip into syncretism. In linguistics, it means the merging of different inflectional varieties of a word during the development of a language. According to Wikipedia, syncretism is the practice of combining different beliefs in various schools of thought. Syncretism involves the merging of or assimilation of several originally discrete traditions, especially in the theology and mythology of religion, thus asserting an underlying unity and allowing for an inclusive approach to other faiths. While syncretism in art and culture is sometimes likened to eclecticism, in the realm of religion, syncretism specifically denotes a more integrated merging of beliefs into a unified system, distinct from eclecticism, which implies a selective adoption of elements from different traditions without necessarily blending them into a new, cohesive belief system. Syncretism also manifests in politics, known as syncretic politics. So that's what syncretism means. One advantage, however, of this preference for pluricausal explanation is that apparent refutations can be dealt with through the discovery of some additional hitherto ignored factor. Mandel applies all the subtle skills of a medieval schoolman to distinguishing relevant factors, for example, identifying no less than 5 distinct wars within the Second World War. The effect is to deprive social theory of the interaction with potentially disconfirming observations. Thus, Mandel argues that Trotsky was mistaken in his, quote, short-term predictions, end quote, rather than in his, quote, understanding of the grand lines of development of our century, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Stalinism and capitalism did go into crisis, albeit in the 1960s and 1970s rather than at the end of the Second World War. It is as if Trotsky's theory were a film which, when first shown, was run too fast. Slowed down to the proper speed, the film is true. This hardly accords with the urgency of Trotsky's prediction, his insistence on the temporary and parasitic character of the Stalin regime, his claim that if the war did not issue in revolution, Marxism itself would stand refuted. A theory thus denied any friction with experience is likely not to anticipate events, but always to lag behind events, preserving its integrity at the price of the loss of any explanatory power. New section. The Big Battalions. The paradox of Orthodox Trotskyism is that by seeking to preserve the letter of Trotsky's theory, it deprived the latter of much of its substance. This is clearest politically with respect to the agency of socialist revolution. Trotsky, in line with his general commitment to classical Marxism, conceives socialism as the self-emancipation of the working class. But if the Eastern European countries were deformed workers' states, then forces other than the proletariat could carry through socialist revolution. Trotsky had, in his polemic against Lenin's Lenin's conception of the party after the 1903 Congress identified the danger of, quote, substitutionism, end quote. Quote, the group of, quote, professional revolutionaries, end quote, was not marching at the head of the conscious proletariat. It was acting in, in place of the proletariat, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky later accepted Leninism as consistent with proletarian self-emancipation, but in their disarray after 1945, many of his followers were drawn towards substitutionism. Not that they were in any position to supplant the working class, but they attached their hopes to forces acting in its name. I think it's debatable that I think it's very debatable whether Trotsky felt that his critique of substitutionism was consistent with Leninism, or if he just abandoned his critique of substitutionism in favor of Leninism. But that's just my opinion. The definite move from a politics of self-emancipation to a politics of Jacobinism definitely seems evident in Trotsky's political development. But that's just an observation for myself, which you are free to, or not, or you are free to disagree with. Populist policy of long-term, quote, entry sui generis, end quote, into the Communist parties was one example of this tendency, but the greatest temptation came in the case of those revolutions in what we now call the, quote, Third World, end quote, where Stalinist movements led peasant armies to victory around a program of national rather than social liberation, such as in Yugoslavia, China, Cuba, and Vietnam. On the face of it, these upheavals might be thought to count as a refutation of the theory of permanent revolution, according to which backward countries can only defeat imperialism, where the working class assumes leadership of the national struggle and breaks with capitalism. The response of the Fourth International leadership was rather to assert the contrary. Thus, the Third World Congress declared in 1951, quote, the dynamics of the Yugoslav Revolution confirms the theory of permanent revolution on all points, end quote, the Fourth International. Just because this and later such revolutions had secured national independence and carried extensive land reforms or nationalizations, they must have been carried out under the leadership of the working class. The alternative, that the theory of permanent revolution was false or at least required modification, was simply too much even to consider. Other inconvenient developments, the relatively peaceful disintegration of the European colonial empires and the transformation of some third world states into newly industrializing countries, were disposed of by asserting that these changes failed to meet Trotsky's insistence that, quote, the complete and genuine solution, not the beginning of a solution, of the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, end quote, could be achieved only by the proletarian overthrow of capitalism. Characterizing the great post-Third World revolutions as socialist might preserve Trotskyist orthodoxy, but at the price of introducing new difficulties. For one thing, as Michael Louvy acknowledges in all these cases, quote, not only was the proletariat not directly the social agent of revolution, but the Revolutionary Party was not the direct organic expression of the proletariat, end quote. Nevertheless, the Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cuban Communist parties, quote, were the political and programmatic expression of the proletariat by virtue of their adherence to the historic interests of the working class, end quote, and the fact that their, quote, ideologies were proletarian, end quote. Michael Louvy. So a movement can be proletarian even if it contains very few workers among its members and has no involvement in the everyday life and struggles of the proletariat. The scope thus offered for substitutionism is clear enough, particularly when we recall that the, quote, proletarian ideologies, end quote, of these movements were variants of, quote, of the Stalinist, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote, which Trotsky so unremittingly attacked as vulgarized and debased distortions of the revolutionary socialist tradition. The entire line of reasoning irresistibly calls to mind Brecht's famous poem after the 1953 Berlin uprising, in which he suggested the East German government should dissolve the people and elect another one in its place. But even granted the proletarian character of the Yugoslav, Chinese, and Vietnamese communist parties, and even more dubiously of the 26th of July movement in Cuba, which only espoused Marxism-Leninism after the 1959 revolution, there remained another more fundamental problem. How could Stalinism, dubbed by Trotsky counter-revolutionary on a world scale, overthrow capitalism in these instances? The answer was simplicity itself. These movements were not Stalinist after all. As Mandel put it, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat was established in Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba by programmatic revolutionary leaderships that had a revolutionary practice but a theory and program that was adequate neither to its own revolution nor especially in the world revolution, end quote. Neither Stalinist, that's end quote, Ernest Mandel, neither Stalinist nor, quote, revolutionary Marxist, end quote, Tito, Mao, Ho, and Castro were, quote, left centrists, end quote, whose quote, lack of correct program, end quote, had, quote, negative practical consequences, end quote. Nevertheless, quote, the fact that they carried out a socialist revolution is infinitely more important than their lack of an adequate theory, end quote. Mandel. Quote, centrism, end quote, is the name given by Lenin and Trotsky to those socialist currents characterized by their vacillation between reform and revolution, the classic instances being Karl Kautsky and the Austro-Marxists. How then could, quote, left centrists, end quote, carry through socialist revolutions in parts of the Third World? Answers to this question tend to lay great stress on objective circumstances, what Louvy calls, quote, the logic of the revolutionary process itself, end quote. Thus, Pierre Rousset, I think, is like a member of the Fourth International, or I think he's like a specialist in Asia. Like I think he, he's on the International Viewpoint website, which does produce some interesting commentary from time to time, or at least I've seen interesting commentary come from it. Pierre Rousset is a member of the leadership of the Fourth International, particularly involved in Solidarity with Asia. He is a member of the NPA in France. He has 158 articles on the channel, on their website. So, thus Pierre Rousset, in 1975, argues that a combination of socioeconomic pressures and national tradition, notably Confucianism, allowed the Vietnamese communists to break, quote, empirically, end quote, with Stalinism and carry through the anti-colonial revolution to its finish. No doubt such factors must be taken into account in an explanation of the Vietnamese revolution, but these hardly encourage one to describe it as a socialist revolution, at least from the standpoint of classical Marxism, which places such a strong stress on the self-conscious character of such transformations. History instead operated according to Hegel's rules of reason, bringing about socialist revolutions whose agents are largely unaware of what they are doing. Very important sentence right there. History instead operates according to Hegel's rules of reason, bringing about socialist revolutions whose agents are largely unaware of what they are doing. In Trotsky's own words, quote, the permanent character of the revolution thus becomes a law placing itself above history, independent of the policy of the leadership and of the material development of revolutionary events, end quote. In any case, if, quote, pragmatic revolutionary leaderships, end quote, can get rid of capitalism in large parts of the Third World, what is the point of the Fourth International? In some variant or another, this difficulty had been around since the late 1940s, but was rendered more acute by the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979. I'm sure lots of people are familiar with this, but I need a refresher on all the characters involved. So according to Wikipedia, the Nicaraguan Revolution encompassed the rising opposition of the Somoza dictatorship in the 1960s and 1970s, the campaign led by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, to oust the dictatorship in 1978 to 1979, the subsequent efforts of the FSLN to govern Nicaragua from 1979 to 1990, and the Contra War, which was waged between the FSLN-led government of Nicaragua and the United States-backed Contras from 1981 to 1990. The revolution marked a significant period in the history of Nicaragua and revealed the country as one of the major proxy war battlegrounds of the Cold War, attracting much international attention. The initial overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship in 1978 to 79 was a dirty affair, and the Contra War of the 1980s took the lives of tens of thousands of Nicaraguans and was the subject of fierce international debate. Because of the political turmoil, failing economy, and decreasing government influence during the 1980s, both the FSLN, a leftist collection of political parties, and the Contras, a rightist collection of counter-revolutionary groups, received large amounts of aid from the Cold War superpowers, respectively the Soviet Union and the United States. A peace process started with the Sapoa Accords in 1988, and the Contra War ended after the signing of the Tela Accord in 1989 and the demobilization of the FSLN and the Contra armies. A second election in 1990 resulted in the election of a majority of anti-Sandinista parties and the FSLN handing over power. I think Dan Labat's, who's like affiliated, he's put out some really actually good. I mean, I haven't read a lot, but he has a piece by about Boris Souverin and Trotsky that's really good. All right, that's going up on the channel, and also there's a piece by him about like a very succinct piece about campism. That is, I think is like very, very succinct explanation of that whole phenomenon. But anyway, he wrote a book, I think, on like something about the Nicaraguan Revolution. Well, he did write a book, and I think he comments frequently on Nicaragua. I think his like kind of like international area of expertise might be Latin America, but I'm not sure. I think he wrote a novel that's like Trotsky in Tijuana or something like that. Anyway, the American Socialist Workers' Party, this is back to the text. The American Socialist Workers' Party greeted this event along with the Cuban Revolution and the coup, which also in 1979 placed the ill-fated regime of Maurice Bishop in power in Grenada, as, quote, the reemergence of proletarian revolutionists in power, for the first time since the Stalinist-led bureaucracy put an end to such leadership in the Soviet Union and expunged proletarian internationalism from the Communist International more than half a century ago. That's by, end quote, that's by Jack Barnes, 1983. As you know, in the American context, the American Socialist Workers' Party, after in like the 1980s, became, its main thing was like promoting Castro and the Cuban Revolution. A lot of people, its references to Trotskyism diminished very much so, and its references to people like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara drastically increased. If you look, I have a video up on the channel that's about the development of American Trotskyism by Robert J. Alexander, on one of the last ones. In that series on American Trotskyism, talks about this development in the American Socialist Workers' Party. So check that out. Back to the text. The American Socialist Workers' Party... Oh, that's what I meant to look up. Maurice Bishop. Maurice Rupert Bishop, who lived from 1944 to 1983, was a Grenadian revolutionary and leader of the New Jewel movement, a Marxist-Leninist party that sought to prioritize socioeconomic development, education, and black liberation. They came to power during the 13th of March 1979 revolution that removed Eric Gary from office. Bishop headed the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada from 1979 to 1983, when he was dismissed from his post and executed during the coup by Bernard Cord, leading to upheaval. And the People's Revolutionary Government was proclaimed of Grenada was proclaimed on the 13th of March 1979 after the Marxist-Leninist New Jewel movement overthrew the government of Grenada in a revolution, making Grenada the only socialist state within the Commonwealth. In Grenada, the revolution is referred to as the March 13th Revolution of 1979, or simply the Revolution. The government suspended the constitution and ruled by decree until a factional conflict broke out, culminating in an invasion by the United States on the 25th of October 1983. And finally, just sorry for looking at all these things up, but the New Jewel movement, or the New Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, was a Marxist-Leninist vanguard party in the Caribbean island nation of Grenada that was led by Maurice Bishop. Established in 1973, the New Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, or the New Jewel movement, issued its manifesto prior to the granting of independence to Grenada in 1974. The movement took control of the country with a successful bloodless revolution in 1979 and ruled by decree as the People's Revolutionary Government until 1983. In 1983, Bishop was killed by paramilitaries affiliated with hardliners in his own party. This led to a military government which was deposed by the U.S. military in a 1983 invasion. So, that's who Maurice Bishop is, and that's the Grenada Revolution. Moreover, this is the text, back to the text. Moreover, the American Socialist Workers' Party leader, Jack Barnes, argues Trotskyism is itself an obstacle to this, quote, convergence, end quote, since probably, quote, 80% of those on a world scale who present themselves as Trotskyists are, are irreformable sectarians, end quote. Jack Barnes. And just the Wikipedia on Jack Barnes says he was born in 1940 as an American communist and a national secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party. Barnes was elected the party's national secretary in 1972, replacing retiring Farrell Dobbs. Jack Barnes joined the Socialist Workers' Party in the early 1960s as a student at Carleton College in Minnesota and quickly became a leading member of the party's youth wing. From the 1990s to the present, Jack Barnes has directed his party to support the governments of North Korea and Equatorial Guinea, has instructed the party to abstain from anti-war, anti-racist activism, and in January 2016 lent his support to the occupation of federal lands in Oregon by militia movement members. Barnes was a key advocate of the party's, quote, turn to industry, end quote, in the 1970s, its exit from the Fourth International in the 1980s, and its orientation towards the Cuban Communist Party in the 1990s. So that's the Wikipedia of Jack Barnes. Back to the text. Moreover, the American Socialist Workers' Party leader, Jack Barnes, argues Trotskyism is itself... Sorry, I read that. The roots of this sectarianism are to be found in Trotsky himself, since the theory of permanent revolution rules out the possibility of the establishment of, quote, workers' and farmers' governments, end quote, representing, quote, a stage in the class struggle where capitalist property relations have not yet been abolished, but workers and farmers have conquered political power through a genuine revolution, end quote. Jack Barnes, or that's what it says that quote's from. The Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Grenadian revolutions all passed through such a stage preliminary to the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a change involving primarily the nationalization of the means of production, which occurred only in China. These arguments represent the most dramatic example of the drift to Stalinism, which had been a constant temptation for Orthodox Trotskyists since the late 1940s. The idea of, quote, workers and farmers' governments, end quote, in particular was strikingly reminiscent of Lenin's old formula of the, quote, revolutionary democratic... One second, sorry. Of Lenin's old formula of the, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, which Trotskyists had forcefully criticized after the 1905 revolution and then again in the debates of the 1920s. The American Socialist Workers' Party indeed swiftly developed a style of political analysis strongly reminiscent of Pablo's division of the world into, quote, progressive Eastern and reactionary Western blocs in the early 1950s. This whole change of direction was strongly resisted by Mandel and his supporters within the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. But these efforts could not conceal the fact that the American Socialist Workers' Party under Barnes had simply drawn the consequences of Orthodox Trotskyism. Both sides were agreed that proletarian revolutions had occurred without the proletariat taking any active part. It mattered little whether the makers of these revolutions were called, quote, revolutionary Marxists, end quote, or, quote, pragmatic revolutionaries, end quote, or even, quote, Stalinists, end quote. If they could achieve socialism from above without workers' councils taking power, then Trotskyism had lost its raison d'etre. Not even all Mandel's formidable forensic skills could conceal this simple fact. Orthodox Trotskyists outside the United Secretariat of the Fourth International have attempted similar balancing acts to Mandel's with equal lack of success. When the British Revolutionary Communist Party anticipated the Fourth International's development by declaring the Eastern European, quote, buffer zone, end quote, worker states in 1947-8, Ted Grant formulated the concept of, quote, proletarian Bonapartism. This was an interesting example of what Lakatos called concept stretching. where a theory is defended from refutation by the extension of its concepts to cover apparently aberrant cases. Marx had coined the term Bonapartism to describe regimes where the state, while controlled by the bourgeoisie, acted in the latter's class. While not controlled by the bourgeoisie, acted in the latter's class interest. Grant, following but developing formulations of Trotsky's, extended the concept from capitalist to workers' states and advanced the general proposition that, quote, for quite a lengthy period there can be a conflict between the state and the class, which that state represents, end quote. Quote, Stalinism, end quote, Grant argued, quote, is a form of Bonapartism that bases itself in the institution of state ownership, but it is different from the norm of a worker state as fascism or bourgeois Bonapartism differs from the norm of bourgeois democracy, end quote. On this basis, Grant was more generous than the United Secretariat of the Fourth International about the success of, quote, proletarian Bonapartism, end quote, in the Third World. In 1978, describing China, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Syria, Angola, Mozambique, Aden, Benin, and Ethiopia as deformed worker states. Although criticized by other Orthodox Trotskyists, the list reflected Grant's relatively consistent use of statization of the economy as the criterion of the existence of a worker state. Grant resisted, however, the temptation to welcome the makers of these revolutions into the Trotskyist camp. For example, in 1949, attacked the IS's treatment of Tito as a, quote, unconscious Trotskyist, end quote. The pressure towards substitutionism nevertheless found political expression. Having joined the Labor Party with the rest of the Revolutionary Communist Party majority in 1949, Ted Grant became the principal figure of the militant tendency, which emerged as the strongest organized left grouping inside the Labor Party at the end of the 1970s. Practicing a far more long-term version of entrism than anything envisaged by Trotsky, militant supporters expected catastrophic economic crisis to radicalize the Labor Party and provide mass support for a left government which would effect, quote, an entirely peaceful transformation of society, end quote, by means of a large-scale nationalization authorized by Parliament through an enabling act. On this scenario, transformed social democracy would play the kind of role which other Orthodox Trotskyists thought some versions of Stalinism would perform. Sorry, 1 second. New section. Into the Watchtower, Deutscher and Anderson. The contradictions discussed in the previous section all derive from the effort to uphold Trotsky's analysis of the USSR as a workers' state at the price of effectively recognizing Stalinism as a revolutionary force while seeking at the same time to maintain an independent Trotskyist movement. There were two ways out of the dilemma involved: to abandon the theory of degenerated and deformed worker states as the tendencies discussed in Chapter 4 and 5 did, or to give up the project formulated by Trotsky in 1933 of building revolutionary organizations independent of Stalinism and social democracy. The most distinguished representative of the latter alternative is Isaac Deutscher. Deutscher's formidable literary gifts. Perry Anderson calls him, quote, one of the greatest socialist writers of this century, end quote, were demonstrated above all in his classic biography of Trotsky, which played a major role in preserving the latter's reputation and introducing the generation radicalized in the 1960s to the classical Marxist tradition. Just a side note, this is Perry Anderson, along with Tariq Ali, and I can't name all of the people involved, but were like important in the New Left Review in Great Britain, which put out New Left books, and then which turned into Verso Press. And I'm not sure about this. I could be talking with my foot in my mouth. I don't think I am, but generally, as followers of Orthodox Trotskyism, represented by Isaac Deutscher, who was probably the most closest to Stalinism of all the people involved in international Trotskyism, or one of the most high profile, I should say. As admirers of Isaac Deutscher, as a political commentator, not just as a biographer, but as a political commentator as well, represented, I would say, the tendency that had a lot of emphasis on Deutscher, even though Deutscher wasn't really affiliated with a party. I don't know if Perry Anderson or Tariq Ali were, but definitely they were on the conservative end of Trotskyism, the most orthodox and the most willing to hold on to the degenerated worker state thesis well past its prime. And I would say that a lot of like the publishers, I would say that just as like New Left Review comes out of New Left books became Verso, I think Pluto Press, the other major left-wing press this comes out of the UK. I'm sure there's other ones. Was originally, I don't think this is the case anymore, was originally the publisher of the Socialist Workers' Party, the International Socialist, the tendency around Tony Cliff. So those two book publishers emerge out of Trotskyist parties, and I believe, and I'm not sure what the case is with Haymarket Press. I think Haymarket Press does tend to put stuff out that is by the Cliff tendency. So for instance, like Chris Harman, Callinicos, Duncan Hollis, Molyneux, John Molyneux, people of that sort. So Paul LeBlanc, who's an American, but I think all these people are kind of, if you think about the international socialists around Tony Cliff, is like a world tendency as opposed to like the local just a local national tendency. I think they're all part of like what you might call like American Cliffite Trotskyism, and I think that is where Haymarket Books emerges. So Haymarket Books doesn't put out books about like the degenerated workers' state in like in terms of like, obviously puts out a lot of books with its like Haymarket and the critical social science. I mean, not Haymarket, the historical materialism and critical social science theories that are just like publications of popular publications of academic Marxist books. But I think in terms of like the books that they actually put out themselves that are related to Marxism and socialism are typically coming from Cliffite Trotskyists. So like I think one of their books is might have a couple books about state capitalism in Russia, maybe just one. I think they have a couple, and it's with the usual the cast of like state capitalists in the USSR, Trotskyists who adopted a state capitalist thesis on the USSR, which more or less automatically means being part of Cliffite Trotskyism. What was I going to say? Although that's not entirely true. Like I think some people within like the alliance, I don't know about in the United States, like the people who are influenced by the third camp with their assessment of the USSR, if there's diversity in there. But I know in like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in the UK, to my understanding, there's people within that party while adopting the third campus position and like the political legacy of like say like Max Shachtman and Hal Draper and so on and so forth. More Max Shachtman than Hal Draper for sure. I think within that tendency, there is people who no one accepts the degenerated worker state thesis, but I think a number of people, I think Martin Thomas, who's with Alliance for Workers' Liberty, I think he has a state capitalist theory of the USSR, even though like I think that would be like a minority position within his like party or milieu, or I guess you'd call it the alliance. But anyway, sorry, I'm not even thinking. I feel like I'm not saying clear things, but maybe I am. Anyway, Perry Anderson, born 1938, is a British intellectual, political philosopher, historian, and essayist. Perry Anderson's work ranges across historical sociology, intellectual history, and cultural analysis. What unites Anderson's work is a preoccupation with Western Marxism. Citation needed. Anderson is perhaps best known as the moving force behind the New Left Review. He is a professor of history and sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Perry Anderson has written many books, most recently Brazil Apart, 1964 to 2019, and The H Word, Peripeteia of Hegemony. He is the brother of the political scientist Benedict Anderson. Benedict Anderson writing a lot about nationalism. He wrote a big book called The Imagined Community. But anyway, so that's my ranting or attempting to draw points together, and that was me reading the little bio on Perry Anderson. Now back to the text. The most distinguished representative of the latter alternative is Isaac Deutscher. Deutscher's formidable literary gifts, Perry Anderson calls him, quote, one of the greatest socialist writers of this century, end quote, were demonstrated above all in his classic biography of Trotsky, which played a major role in preserving the latter's reputation and introducing the generation radicalized in the 1960s to the classical Marxist tradition. Yet the thrust of Deutscher's writings was fundamentally opposed to the political direction taken by Trotsky after 1933. Active in the Polish Trotskyist group in the 1930s, Deutscher drafted the arguments on which their opposition to the formation of the Fourth International at the 1938 founding conference was based. During wartime exile in Britain, Deutscher drifted out of the Trotskyist movement. Whether cause or consequence of this direction, Whether cause or consequence of this decision, Deutscher's mature analysis certainly provided it with a rationale. Shachtman observed, quote, Deutscher is overwhelmingly fascinated, you might say obsessed, by analogies between the bourgeois revolutions, the French in particular, and the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote. Max Shachtman. These analogies play the function of establishing a broad identity of structure between bourgeois and proletarian revolutions. This identity, thus posited, is politically important for two reasons. First, Deutscher postulates a general historical law according to which revolutions move from a phase of popular mobilization, in which the revolutionaries enjoy mass support, to one in which they are compelled by events to establish a minority dictatorship that preserves the conquest of the revolution at the price of repression, aimed at, among others, an extreme left which denounces the betrayal of the original uprising's ideals. The emergence of Stalin, like that of Oliver Cromwell and Napoleon before him, was historically inevitable. However, he represented not the betrayal of the revolution, but its continuation. Discussing the methods of compulsion and armed expansion used by the Bolshevik leaders during the Civil War, Deutscher traced, quote, the thread of unconscious historic continuity which led from Lenin's hesitant and shamefaced essays in Revolution by Conquest to the revolutions contrived by Stalin the Conqueror. A similar subtle thread connected Trotsky's domestic policy of these years with the latter practices of his antagonism. Both Trotsky and Lenin appear, each in a different field, as Stalin's unwitting inspirers and prompters. Both were driven by circumstances beyond their control and by their own illusions to assume certain attitudes in which circumstances and their own scruples did not allow them to preserve, attitudes which were ahead of their time, out of tune with the current Bolshevik mentality, and discordant with the main themes of their own lives, end quote. Isaac Deutscher. Stalin's peculiar virtue lay precisely in Stalin's lack of scruple and of sympathy with the classical Marxist tradition, which allowed him to act as the, quote, guardian and trustee of the revolution, end quote, in its conservative phase, launching at the end of the 1920s the, quote, second revolution, end quote, of collectivization and industrialization, and transforming Eastern Europe from 1945, quote, from above and from outside, end quote, by conquest and occupation. Deutscher. Here we may note a second aspect of the analogy Deutscher drew between the bourgeois and socialist revolutions. The English and French revolutions were bourgeois, not because capitalists led them. On the contrary, quote, the leaders were mostly, quote, gentlemen farmers, end quote, in England, and lawyers, doctors, journalists, and other intellectuals in France, end quote. But because of the benefits they brought the bourgeoisie, quote, bourgeois revolution creates the conditions in which bourgeois property can flourish, end quote. Isaac Deutscher. Perry Anderson drew out the implications of extending this feature of bourgeois revolution to its socialist counterpart. Quote, capitalism does not automatically or everywhere require a victorious industrial bourgeoisie to launch it, any more than socialism requires a victoriously industrial proletariat to impose it, end quote. Much more explicitly than was usual in the Orthodox Trotskyist mainstream, Stalinism was thus acknowledged as a revolutionary force in the classical conception of socialism as proletarian self-emancipation abandoned. Deutscher's Trotskyist critics were quick to challenge his identification of bourgeois and socialist revolutions and argue that the working class, because of the working class's separation from the means of production under capitalism, can only become economically dominant by taking political power. See Shachtman 1962 and more generally Callinicos 1989. I forgot to say this earlier, but I have a piece called Isaac Deutscher, The Anatomy of an Apologist on the channel, which is by Jacob, what's his name? Why is it Julius Jacobson, who is one of the founders of the journal New Politics. Julius Jacobson, his wife Phyllis Jacobson, and Hal Draper are the people who kept third camp socialism alive in the United States, or revolutionary third camp socialism alive in the United States, after Shachtman's more conservative, social democratic, and Cold Warrior turn in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So, yeah. Back to the text. Stalin becomes, on Deutscher's interpretation of the Russian Revolution, not the aberration which Trotsky regarded him to be, but an instrument of historical necessity. In a revealing passage, Deutscher invoked Plekhanov, the great theorist of Second International Marxism, to refute Trotsky's, quote, startling conclusion, end quote, that without Lenin the October Revolution would not have occurred. Alistair McIntyre commented, quote, we cannot see why this is necessary for Deutscher's whole argument. If from time to time history presents us with real alternatives, then I am not just part of an inevitable historical progress, end quote. Whereas Trotsky's Marxism, even when he came closest to predicting the inevitable economic breakdown of capitalism in the late 1930s, laid great stress on the, quote, subjective factor, end quote, the role of conscious human agency in transforming society. Deutscher preferred to explain events in the light of an unfolding historical necessity. This had direct political consequences. In the post-war world, Deutscher argued, quote, the class struggle suppressed at the level on which it had been traditionally waged, end quote, was, quote, fought at a different level and in different forms as rivalry between power blocks and as Cold War, end quote. Deutscher. Though Deutscher's sympathies were with the Soviet bloc in this struggle, he preferred to any form of organized political activity withdrawal to a, quote, watchtower, end quote, from where to, quote, watch with detachment and alertness this heaving chaos of a world, to be on a sharp lookout for what is going to emerge from it and to interpret it sin ira e studio, end quote. Deutscher. The most positive development Deutscher detected from his watchtower was the emergence in the USSR after Stalin's death of reformers who he expected would carry out from above the political revolution which Trotsky had believed would come from below. Deutscher cast first Beria, then Malenkov, and finally Khrushchev in the role of leaders of this revolution. Deutscher thus condemned the 1953 Berlin uprising, which was concentrated in the working-class areas which had supported the communists in the Weimar area, as, quote, objectively counter-revolutionary, end quote, because it compromised the idea of a gradual relaxation of the Stalinist regime, advocated by such, quote, reformists, end quote, as Beria. One thing to note that's important here is that the reason that he's saying that it's compromised the idea of gradual relaxation of the Stalinist regime is that he viewed that the self-activity of the East Berlin working class caused the regime, which was for some reason, but God knows why, ostensibly on the path towards, according to Deutscher, leading towards liberalization, to revert to its somehow distant Stalinist past or something like that. Like, the idea was that, if the Berlin workers did not engage in their revolt in 1953, Stalinism would have been defeated much faster. Trying to think of what was I feel like I'm saying like Stalinism was defeated at some point, but I don't really think that is. I think the cult of personality period was over, and the most extensive period of political terror was over, but key aspects of the Stalinist economy, or the economy that was established under Stalinism, remained until the collapse, to my understanding. Although, there wasn't the kind of hero worship of Khrushchev and Brezhnev as there was of Stalin. And Khrushchev lost power in a relatively peaceful, or in a peaceful fashion, not in a democratic fashion. It didn't seem like in a particularly democratic fashion, but in a peaceful fashion, without a bunch of people being executed in the process. So that marked a big change, but Stalinism carried on in other aspects of the Soviet Union. Deutsche thus condemned the 1953 Berlin uprising, which was concentrated in the working class areas which had supported the communists in the Weimar era, as, quote, objectively counter-revolutionary, end quote, because it compromised the idea of a gradual relaxation of the Stalinist regime advocated by such, quote, reformists, end quote, as Beria. Though Deutscher adopted the role as a critical observer of events, ruled out any attempt on his part to build a political organization, his ideas have continued to exert an influence since his death in 1967 as a result of their impact on the gifted group of young British intellectuals that took over the New Left Review in 1962 and transformed it over the following 2 decades into perhaps the major journal of social theory in English. On the New Left Review's history, see Birchall, 1980. Perry Anderson, editor of New Left Review until 1983, is best known for the 2 volumes of his Genealogy of the Modern State so far to have appeared. But Anderson is also the main exponent of a Deutscherite version of Orthodox Trotskyism. Anderson contrasted Trotskyism to Western Marxism as the continuation of the classical tradition, and praised it for having, quote, alone proved capable of an adult view of socialism on a world scale, end quote, Anderson. Nevertheless, Anderson maintained a critical distance from the Trotskyist movement, although other New Left Review editors from the Trotskyist movement, sorry, I misread a line. Nevertheless, Anderson maintained a critical distance from the Trotskyist movement, though other New Left Review editors, notably Tariq Ali, Robin Blackburn, and Quentin Hoare, were for much of the 1970s leading members of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International's British section, the International Marxist Group. I know you know who Tariq Ali and Robin Blackmore are, but I don't know who this other guy is. Quentin Hoare. Quentin Hoare, born 1938, is a British leftist intellectual and literary translator from languages including Italian, French, German, Russian, and Bosnian. After studying modern languages at Oxford University in 1962, Hoare joined the editorial board of New Left Review, serving as its managing editor from 1963 to 1979. He and his wife, the Croatian historian Branka Magas, eventually resigned in 1994. Hoare was a founding editor of the journal Labor Focus on Eastern Europe, a founding member in 1993 of the Alliance to Defend Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in 1997 became director of the Bosnian Institute. Hoare edited the Pelican Marx Library, which ran to 8 volumes. As a translator, he has worked in several languages, winning major awards for his translations from Italian, French, and German, the John Florio Prize in 1978-79 for Antonio Gramsci's selections from the Political Writings 1921-26, and the Scott Moncrief Prize in 1984 for Sartre's War Diaries, and the Schlegel-Tieck Prize in 1989 for Hermann Grab's short stories. Hoare's son is the historian Marco Attila Hoare. Okay, so that's Quentin Hoare. While describing Trotsky's, quote, fundamental hypotheses, end quote, as, quote, unsurpassed to this day as a framework for investigation of Soviet society, end quote, Perry Anderson criticized Trotsky's, quote, fundamental hypotheses, end quote, for depicting Stalinism as, quote, merely a quote, exceptional or, quote, aberrant, end quote, refraction of the general laws of transition from capitalism to socialism, end quote. On the contrary, quote, the structures of bureaucratic power and mobilization pioneered under Stalin proved both more dynamic and more general a phenomenon on the international plane than Trotsky ever imagined, end quote. Anderson. Indeed, quote, Stalinism proved to be not just an apparatus but a movement capable not only of keeping power in a backward environment dominated by scarcity, the USSR, but of actually winning power in environments that were yet more backward and destitute, China and Vietnam, end quote. Perry Anderson. In line with the contrast between East and West, which is one of the main themes of Anderson's historical writings, it seems that while a classical revolutionary strategy remains appropriate in the bourgeois democracies of advanced capitalism, Stalinism is the normal form taken by anti-capitalist movements in the Third World. See, for example, the suspiciously Andersonian tones of the criticism of the, quote, sectarian workerism, end quote, of the Workers' Party of Brazil in Sater, 1987. Other New Left Review editors drew eminently Deutscherite conclusions from this analysis. Thus, Fred Holliday, arguing that the Second Cold War that broke out in the late 1970s was a continuation of Deutscher's, quote, great contest, end quote, a, quote, inner systemic conflict between capitalism and communism, end quote, in which the sympathies of the Western left should be with the Eastern Bloc as the embodiment, however bureaucratically distorted, of the world proletariat in a global class struggle between capital and labor. And as a tension between NATO and the Warsaw Pact were at least temporarily alleviated in the era of the Glasnost and Perestroika, Tariq Ali, who acknowledged the influence of, quote, Isaac Deutscher, Leon Trotsky, and Ernest Mandel in that order, end quote, hailed Gorbachev as the agent of the, quote, political revolution, parenthesis, which is already underway, end parenthesis, end quote, in the USSR, a, quote, revolution from above, end quote, dictated by the dependence of the Soviet Union's survival, on the, quote, abolition of the bureaucratic caste, end quote, Tariq Ali. The connection between these conclusions, which depict the Stalinist states globally and the reform wing of the Soviet bureaucracy, domestically as progressive forces, and the Orthodox Trotskyist theory of bureaucratic worker states, shall be clear in the light of the present and preceding chapters. Let us now consider the ideas of those Trotskyists who, in order to avoid such conclusions, rejected the theory.